Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. As tensions across the Korean Peninsula evolve, the ROK-U.S. alliance is once again being tested not just by North Korea's behavior, but by shifting expectations within the alliance itself. Now, with the next Seoul-Washington Summit set for August 25th and talks of a possible Trump-Kim meeting later this year, key decisions lie ahead on everything from defense cost sharing to troop structure, human rights, and diplomatic strategy. And as Washington looks to re-engage Pyongyang, questions are also growing about how closely Seoul will be involved in shaping the process. To break down where things stand and where they may be headed, we're joined by Victor Cha, Korea Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. A big welcome, Dr. Cha.
Thank you. Happy to be with you.
Thank you for joining us. Now, let's begin our discussion with what many see as the core friction point in the alliance lately. In your recent CSIS brief from late July, you noted that defense cost sharing has become Trump's primary pressure tool against Seoul. Could you elaborate when or where exactly did he make that shift clear in your view? And what message does it send as OPCON and troop structure come back into focus?
Well, the whole question of cost sharing is basically something called the Special Measures Agreement, or SMA, which is usually a 4 to 5 year agreement that's negotiated between the United States and South Korea about how much South Korea should pay for the non-personnel cost of stationing U.S. forces on the Korean Peninsula. For Donald Trump, he's had a long history of believing that the Koreans don't pay enough, or allies in general don't pay enough for the privilege of having U.S. forces in their countries. And two particular targets have always been Germany and South Korea, because these are also two countries that run massive trade surpluses with the United States. So he puts these two things together, the fact that there are massive trade surpluses and the fact that these countries, in his mind, are paying less than they should for the cost of stationing these U.S. forces. We saw it in the Trump 1 administration, where he made very clear that South Korea should pay 5 times the amount that it was paying. At the time, it was paying just about $1 billion, and he said it should be $5 billion. And now in the second Trump administration, he's talked about upping it to as high as $10 billion. These, in fact, are not realistic numbers, but they are indicative of the fact that he feels like allies should pay more for having U.S. forces in their country.
Right. Then, so if the U.S. actually reduces ground forces while expanding air and naval presence, do you think deterrence still can hold, or does that shift invite miscalculation from adversaries like North Korea or China?
So it's a great question, and I think if it's done correctly, it can enhance deterrence and defense. But if it's done incorrectly, it can hurt deterrence and defense. For it to be done incorrectly, this would be the United States acting unilaterally and deciding they're going to pull a brigade out of Korea and not bring it back without consulting with the South Koreans, without making it part of a larger alliance modernization plan that would be accompanied with, for example, increases in South Korean defense spending, enhancement of conventional military capabilities. If it's part of a plan, then it looks like it's enhancing deterrence and defense. But if it's done sort of unilaterally, then deterrence is in the mind of the target state. So it's not so much whether the U.S. and South Korea feel, yes, we can still manage defense on the peninsula. If the North Koreans see the United States unilaterally pulling out, what matters is how they view it, and they might view that as a weakness in the alliance, and therefore might see deterrence as being undermined. So this idea of changing the force structure on the peninsula, rebalancing it from ground forces to air and naval, the main message here is that this needs to be done in a carefully coordinated alliance first plan that talks about these things as strengthening and not weakening the alliance.
Right. So it's not just about numbers, it's how these forces are actually positioned by dialogue between the two countries. Now, since OPCON always comes back during times of strategic recalibration, Dr. Cha, do you think it could become a political bargaining chip under Trump's self-defense framing? And how might that reshape the pace of U.S. ROK military coordination?
Well, when we think about OPCON transition, and what we're talking about here is the return of wartime operational control to the Republic of Korea. Um, this is both political and it's military. It's military in the sense that should wartime OPCON go back to Korea, then South Korea has to have certain capabilities having to do with overhead satellite intelligence, general ISR capabilities, command and control capabilities to be able to manage a wartime situation. So there are military prerequisites, and I think the militaries, the South Korean and the U.S. militaries, have a carefully planned out structure that tests and demonstrates readiness at each stage of an OPCON transition, plan. That is the military plan, and that is the way this should be carried out. It should be based on readiness and capabilities and proper indicators of whether requisite capabilities are being fulfilled. The political side of OPCON transition is when this process, which is a military process, becomes politicized in the context of things like returning, and I use quotation marks, sovereignty to South Korea, terms of that nature. This usually ends up calling for an accelerated OPCON transition process, which is not necessarily a good thing because the two sides might not be ready. And again, this has an impact on deterrence and readiness if the North Koreans perceive this as a weakening of the alliance rather than a strengthening of the alliance. So again, here there's a military guidelines for how this should be done, a military process, but it is also political. And I think we need to avoid the political aspects of this and really focus on letting the professionals do this in the right way.
Right, definitely. Now, let's also move on to the upcoming August 25th summit between Seoul and Washington. Though there are definitely a wide range of topics for the two to discuss, what do you see as the real strategic objective for the Trump administration? And do you think there's risks Seoul may be underestimating as the two leaders sit down?
One of the most important things, so as your viewers know, this will be the first summit meeting between President Lee and President Trump. These first meetings are extremely important. They set the tone for the relationship. The personal chemistry between the two leaders is very important. It filters down and it affects the entire alliance relationship. If the two leaders get along well, that's good for the alliance relationship. If the two leaders don't get along, then it could be very difficult. So that aspect of it is clearly very important. As you said, there are many issues to discuss. They're just coming off of the announcement of a framework trade and investment agreement. That's very good. That's a good platform that avoided the 25% or even higher tariffs that could have gone to Korea as a result of Trump's reciprocal tariff and Liberation Day tariffs. So that's very good that they're coming into this with an agreement in hand. They'll be wanting to work out some of the details of that agreement, but also looking at other things in the relationship, as we mentioned, having to do with the alliance, having to do with foreign policy, having to do with relations with China, relations with Japan, the DPRK Russia relationship as a result of the war in Ukraine. So while I would say the conversation up until this point has been completely dominated by tariffs and trade, the alliance, this summit will provide the opportunity to open space for the two leaders to talk about the broad range of issues they will have to deal with in the alliance, rather than only a focus on trade and investment. That will certainly be part of it. There are a lot of good things that can happen between Korea and the United States, between Trump and Lee, in terms of economic cooperation, whether we're talking about strategic energy or shipbuilding or supply chains or emerging technology or global health. There are many positive things. But again, up until this point, because of the unusual nature of how Trump rolled out the tariffs and the political crisis in Korea from last December until June because of the impeachment crisis, the focus was entirely on tariffs. And now at the summit, they'll be able to talk about the broad range of issues that are important to the two countries.
Right. That gives us a clearer picture of what's really going to be online this time. Now, as for North Korea, then, you've previously mentioned possibilities for a Trump-Kim Jong-un meeting during the APEC period. But just this morning, we hear that North Korean leader Kim Yo-jong, North Korean leader's sister rather, Kim Yo-jong, rejected such possibilities. How do you see the chances of this sit down? And if the summit does happen, what could actually be on the table?
So it's really hard to make a prediction about whether they will be successful in arranging a meeting. We know that President Trump is interested in meeting again. He hasn't really spoken about the timing, but he's clearly interested in meeting again. He considers Kim Jong-un to be a friend of his, not just another leader, but a friend of his. So there's clearly an interest on the U.S. side. The idea of it possibly happening around APEC is really based on what we saw in Trump 1, where President Trump used the opportunity of going to South Korea to basically tweet out to the North Korean leader to meet him in Panmunjom, and that is actually what happened. So you can't put that past President Trump to do that again. There are no standard policy conventions when you're talking about Donald Trump. He'll do things often in unpredictable ways. But what we're clearly seeing from the North Korean side are signals that they're not interested. Whether these are genuine signals or they're just playing hard to get, trying to raise the price of entry for re-engaging in talks, it's hard to tell. But right now, very clearly, they are trying to show very little interest towards the United States or towards the Lee government, despite some of the initial tension reduction measures that have taken place by the Lee government.
Right. So, in fact, in the past months, North Korea has openly rejected denuclearization as a precondition for talks, and it seems like they're continuing that stance. So, at this point, then, Dr. Cha, do you think the U.S. should kind of change how it defines success in terms of negotiations? Would starting a freeze or step-by-step deal be now the only realistic option?
It's a good and it's a fair question. I mean, we've been dealing with this now for 35, almost 40 years. Many different agreements, both bilateral, multilateral, many different presidents, many different approaches, carrots, sticks, and none of them have been successful. And in the meantime, North Korea has on the order of 50 nuclear weapons and maybe fissile material for 90 nuclear weapons, according to public reporting. So there is a serious question about whether what we've done thus far has failed and whether we should try a new approach. I cannot speak for the Trump administration. All I can say is that I think the one thing we've learned about Donald Trump in terms of how he approaches many of these foreign policy issues is he's extremely pragmatic about it, and he's not constrained by policy conventions. So while he may say that denuclearization is still the goal, he may be willing to look at denuclearization in sequence steps over a long period of time that begin to look in practical terms more like threat reduction than denuclearization. But we don't have a clear sense of that yet, obviously, because the leaders haven't engaged and there hasn't been any public sort of policy review or policy statements by the president, his national security advisor, Secretary Rubio, or any member of the administration on this particular issue. So I do think this summit coming up August 25th will provide an opportunity for them, the two leaders, to make a statement. about North Korea. I expect it to still talk about denuclearization, but at the same time show an openness to talking about how to reduce threats at the same time.
Right, so we'll have to keep close tabs on how we will have to define progress in in the months to come. Now, broadening out to regional dynamics, you've warned that North Korea's growing military ties with Russia now intersect directly with U.S. priorities in Ukraine and beyond. Could you elaborate for us? Has Pyongyang moved from a regional threat to a global spoiler?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair way of putting it. The DPRK-Russia relationship now extends far beyond. Well, there wasn't really a relationship up until the war in Ukraine. It was largely dominated by China, but the war in Ukraine provided an opportunity for Kim Jong-un coming out of the COVID pandemic to really be able to retool, to grow, to gain more supplies that he was stocked out of during the pandemic. It was a very important positive step for North Korea. And now it has become a relationship that expands, as you said, beyond simply the DPRK-Russia bilateral relationship to include North Korean troops in the middle of Europe fighting a war, and Russia providing support for North Korea that could increase North Korea's capabilities in East Asia, on the Korean Peninsula and East Asia. So this started out as a tactical relationship, Russia's need for munitions and North Korea's need for food and fuel, to becoming really a strategic relationship where Putin is now able, through this relationship with Kim, to affect U.S. security interests, not just in Europe, but also in Asia. And Kim Jong-un is now able to affect U.S. security interests through the relationship with Russia, not just on the Korean Peninsula, but now in the middle of Europe. So I think this will be a big topic of conversation between the two presidents, President Lee and President Trump. And I imagine that if Xi Jinping comes to APEC, as he has said he's going to do in Busan in the fall, it will also be a big topic of conversation between the U.S. president and the Chinese leader. It is already, I've made many trips to Europe in the last year, it is already a big topic of conversation among EU leaders.
Right, so deepening ties between Russia and North Korea seems to be a very concerning topic for many. Now, let's also touch upon the InterKorean channel. It definitely remains frozen as of now, and if any meaningful progress towards a Washington-Pyongyang summit actually happens, how can South Korea push back against being sidelined again? And do you think Washington sees it as a concern if Seoul actually gets left out of the process?
So I think it'll be very important for President Lee to make that point to President Trump, that if there is an opportunity for re-engagement and even summit diplomacy re-engagement, that the South Korean president has to make clear that South Korea has to have a role in this. I think for the previous President Moon Jae-in, South Korea almost had a built-in role because there was really no direct contact between U.S. and North Korea until the summitry started in Singapore and then Hanoi and then in Panmunjom. But now, because Trump does have a relationship with Kim Jong-un and can contact him directly, there is the danger of what's called Korea passing, where they could be meeting and talking above the heads of the South Koreans. And of course, for North Korea, they would welcome that. They would actually try to promote that as a U.S. DPRK bilateral dialogue, bypassing Seoul. So this summit, again, I think provides a very important point for South Korea and the South Korean president to make clear that it's very important for the alliance that that the United States includes South Korean equities and includes South Korea in any direct conversations with North Korea.
Right, and that's something we'll have to watch very closely into. Now, let's also touch upon the human rights narrative. South Korea is considering suspending its annual North Korea human rights report, while the latest U.S. report on that significantly kind of softened its tone on that. Do you see this as a diplomatic restraint or a deeper shift in priorities on both sides?
It's a fair question to ask. I have to say my own view on this is I'm disappointed that the human rights agenda, which was quite prominent during previous U.S. and South Korean administrations, has fallen off. Both in a Trump administration and in a Lee government. In a sense, I expect that in a Lee government, a more progressive government where they have tended to de-emphasize the human rights issues for fear of offending North Korea and making it harder to engage in inter-Korean economic or political engagement. But for the United States, this should be an issue that continues. Maybe the downplaying of North Korean human rights is also tied to the Doge effect in the United States, where functional bureaus like the Democratic Human Rights and Labor bureaus in the State Department have lost a lot of funding, have lost a lot of personnel. There's no longer a singular North Korea, a special envoy for North Korean human rights, Julie Turner's old position, Ambassador Julie Turner's old position. I've always been of the view that we really cannot talk about security and threat reduction and denuclearization without talking about human rights. Because many of the incentives that are built into any sort of security agreement include economic assistance and business that the U.S. government and U.S. companies would do in North Korea. And it's impossible by U.S. law for these companies and governments to be investing and doing business in North Korea if there are massive human rights violations along the supply chains, according to U.S. law. So these things are actually very much tied together. They're not separate. And it's unfortunate that they are being de-emphasized at this particular time.
Right, so it does really seem to be important to shed light on the human rights issues continuously on a global scale. Now, finally, before we let you go, Dr. Cha, we want your evaluation. So looking ahead to close off 2025, do you think we're entering a window of cautious engagement or another dangerous cycle of provocations and miscalculation?
You mean with North Korea?
Right.
Yeah. Well, right now, sort of our analysis and studies of this at CSIS show that without any engagement, North Korea tends to be more belligerent. When there's no U.S. engagement with North Korea, this usually coincides with periods of belligerent North Korean behavior. But when we are talking to North Korea, they tend not to do the big missile tests or the nuclear tests, things like that. In the immediate term, what concerns me is we have a summit meeting coming up at the end of August, and we are also at the same time in a period of U.S. ROK military exercising. The Ulchi-Focus lens exercises, UFL exercises are taking place and will be taking place while the summit is going on. Again, all of our research shows that when there is no dialogue between the United States and North Korea, and the U.S. and South Korea are in military exercises, then North Korea will tend to react to those exercises in a pretty vigorous way. If you add on top of the fact that the two leaders will be meeting at the end of August, that provides even more incentive for North Korea to make a big statement with some sort of belligerent act. So I'm a bit cautious at this point.
Right, that gives us a sobering but much needed sense of what lies ahead. Thank you so much for helping us connect the dots at such a very pivotal moment, Dr. Cha. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, it's my pleasure.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.